Hello and welcome to the Write channel. My name's Nicola Monaghan and I'm a prize-winning author from Nottingham in the United Kingdom, and today I'm going to talk about traditional publishing, self-publishing, the pros and cons of each one, and how you might decide which is the best route for you. If you already know that you want to self-publish, or you already know you want to look for a traditional deal, then there are some courses and videos highlighted in the description below that will help you. But in the meantime, let's go into the nitty-gritty of what each one is and why you might want to go one way or the other. So I've done both. I've had traditional deals with some quite big publishers and with medium-sized and small publishers. And I've also had indie publishing that I've done myself. I set up my own publishing company and published some collections of short stories and some novellas that I'd written. So first of all, traditional publishing, which is the thing that I did first. So my first few novels all went through traditional publishers, Penguin Random House and Little Brown and those kind of places. And actually my most recent novel also went the traditional route through a publisher called Verve, although they do things slightly differently. So I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end of this video. But traditional publishing can be a great route. One of the things that it gives you is that kind of validation, a kind of rubber stamp to say that you're a proper writer, and a lot of people really want to see their book in print in that way. So it can be that it is the realization of that massive ambition, and it certainly was for me. I'm really glad that I've had that experience of traditional publishing, even though I don't think that every book that I write is going to go that route in the future. The other thing you get from traditional publishing is that your book can be eligible for loads of prizes that are not open necessarily to indie authors. So that can be a real pull, and I've actually won prizes and awards for my books, so that was quite exciting. So you might not want that ruled out for your book. You might want that to be an option, in which case traditional publishing is probably the route you want to go. And on similar lines, if you go a traditional publishing route, then you're likely to see your book on the shelf in your local bookshop. So in the UK, places like Waterstones, and in America, in the States, places like Barnes and Noble. So if your dream is to see your book on a shelf in a particular type of bookshop or in a particular bookshop, then traditional publishing is probably the route to go, because you can do that with indie publishing, but actually it's just much harder. And of course, one of the things that appeals to a lot of people about traditional publishing is the idea that you've got this weight of a really big publisher or even a medium-sized publisher behind your book. And with that, all sorts of things might come. You might have a marketing budget. You might even, if you're really lucky and they're really putting their bets into your book, you might even have some advertising. So that can be quite a big plus of going with a big publisher. And the other thing that you might not think about so much, that isn't perhaps quite as obvious, is that your publisher will deal with an awful lot of the big work and the project management around producing your book. So they'll do things like the cover design, they'll do things like all of the editing and the copy editing and proofreading and typesetting. Those things can actually be quite difficult to do yourself. And so the publishing house has departments where they're absolutely expert in all those things. They work with all of the major retailers, and they know what the retailers want in terms of how books need to look to go on the shelves and be sold and all of those kind of things. And that's actually quite a big deal. So that can be a really good reason to stay with the traditional publisher. So what are the downsides? Well, there are some downsides. There are quite a few, actually. There are loads of things to think about if you're going to try this route. One of the major ones is actually it's really hard to get a traditional publishing deal, and it's increasingly hard. There's lots of competition, fewer types of books are being published, and fewer books are being successful. So to actually make that break into publishing, it can be really difficult, and it has definitely got more difficult since I got my first book published. All of the agents and editors and people that I speak to who work in publishing in the UK, they all say the same, that things have got so much harder in this last 10 to 20 years. So because of that competition and because it's so much harder, one of the things that's happened is that publishers increasingly have really focused on books that they can see big commercial potential for. So that's why we've got an awful lot, for example, of psychological thrillers and crime and books that tend to sell well and that they can get out onto the shelves into the supermarkets. That's what a lot of publishers are looking for now. So to some extent, you might feel that in order to get a traditional book deal at the moment, you have to give up some of your creative freedom, because you have to write the kind of book that publishers want, and that can actually be a big sacrifice. So that's something to think about, because ultimately you can self-publish a book in any genre, any style you want to. And actually, despite what I said about marketing budget, the actual sad truth is that a lot of publishers don't put money into a marketing budget, particularly for debut authors or for authors that don't already have a big name and a big platform behind themselves. So often, actually, you are still doing a lot of that marketing and publicity and pushing the book yourself. So you don't necessarily get that covered by a traditional publisher anyway. And perhaps the biggest downside of traditional publishing is the lead time. It can literally take years and years for your book to be published. So to give you an example, I got my first book deal in 2004. The book came out in 2006. That is fairly typical. It is usually at least a couple of years, often longer than that. And I know when writers get an agent and then they finally get the book deal and they're really excited, often one of the things that is a bit of a downer is that publication date that comes through, and it's actually so far in the future it's hard to imagine even. So that's a big downside. The time between writing a book and it getting out there, it can be quite a long time. And also obviously you've got to factor in the time to find an agent and find a deal on top of that. So it could be years and years and years between you writing a book and it getting out there. Now for a lot of books that won't matter because they're not really about a specific time and place or anything like that. But for some books, let's say you were writing a book about the pandemic, for example. Now I'm not necessarily suggesting that's a great marketable idea, so don't go off and do that necessarily. But if you were, then that's something that's very of the moment, that's very timely. And you might want to get that out quickly so people can read it while it's still fresh in their mind, while it's still a hot topic, while it's something that still feels important. And the other thing is, if you're trying to catch on with a particular trend in publishing, so say for example a good few years ago now when we had 50 Shades of Grey and all of the erotica that was a sudden trend in publishing, if you wrote a book about that as that became the big trend, it would be several years later before it was published and you might have missed the boat. So for that reason sometimes traditional publishing can be a little bit too slow depending on what you're trying to do. So self-publishing then, what are the big advantages and why might you want to do this? Well, one of the main things is that you control your own destiny so that you can go with your own creative vision about what you want to write and you can publish it yourself and you can decide what to cost it, you can decide what it looks like, you can make all of these decisions for yourself and you're fully in control of your book and your vision. So that can be really, really compelling. So another big advantage is that you can get a bigger royalty per copy sold. So to give you a sense of what that means, in traditional publishing, if you've got a print book, then typically you're going to get between about 5%, maybe 12.5% if you're really lucky, per copy sold of the cover price, which isn't very much. If it's an ebook deal, then you might get a bit more. It might be 20, 25%, depending on how generous your publisher is. However, if you're publishing yourself to ebook, say for example on Kindle, you can get as much as 70% of the cover price as your royalty, which is a really big deal. And for that reason, if you can self-publish and you can do it really well and you can sell lots of books, actually it can be slightly easier to make a living from self-publishing. And I have seen a lot of people who've gone the self-publishing route who are actually making a living from their writing. I don't know. I haven't done any research to check whether it's more people who are self-publishing who are making a living or more people who are traditionally published who are making a living. So I can't say and wouldn't like to say one way or another. But it certainly seems from what I've seen out there that it's very much possible to make a living from self-publishing and to treat it as a business and to really make it work, provided that you're prepared to put the work in. And I'll come to that in just a second. Now, the other thing to bear in mind about self-publishing in 2021 is that it's relatively quick and easy. In fact, I've got a video which you can look at if you want to, that shows you how to publish your book to Amazon Kindle in less than 5 minutes. It really is very quick. Once you've got your book ready and you've got your cover designed and all of those things, you can send it to market incredibly quickly. So that can be a massive advantage, and it's certainly a big advantage over traditional publishing if you've got something that's very timely or if you want to get in on a particular trend in publishing. So now on to the cons, on to the disadvantages of self-publishing, or the things that you might want to think about before you decide to take this route. And the first thing I'd say is exactly the same as what I've just said in the advantages, and that is that it's very quick and easy. And the reason that that's a disadvantage as well is that sometimes if your book's not ready and you very quickly just publish it and send it out on Amazon, it's out in the world and it's not very good, that could destroy your reputation as a writer. So that's something to be really careful about if you're thinking of taking this route. You need to make sure that your book's ready. You need to make sure that it's edited as well as you possibly can make it. You need to make sure it's a professional product if you're going to go this route. It's really, really important. So that brings me neatly onto my next point, and that is that to do self-publishing well, if you want to be one of those people who's got a good author reputation, who actually makes a living from their writing, then you're going to need to work really hard. You're going to need to project manage your whole book. You're going to need to make sure it's ready and well edited enough. You're going to need to decide on the vision and the cover design. You're going to need to be able to make these decisions really kind of ruthlessly. You're going to need to be ruthless with yourself about whether your book's ready and what the right vision is for that book. And that can be really, really difficult. It also can be costly, not like necessarily cost you hundreds and hundreds of pounds or dollars, but it can be costly because there are things that it is worth paying for, and that's things like your cover design, some of the editing work and the proofreading, actually just having a third party to tell you whether your book's ready or not, whether it really needs some work, because making that judgment yourself can be really, really difficult. So that's another thing to think about. Are you prepared to invest your time very heavily in your writing or in the marketing business side of your writing? And also, are you prepared to put some money in to make sure that this works the way that it should do, and to make sure that the product you produce is as good as it should be? And finally, on the cons of self-publishing, something that a lot of people find very important, especially debut novelists, and that is that often when you're self-publishing, it's not very economical to actually have a print book and have a print book out there. So in fact, you often only end up doing the ebooks. And for you, when you're first publishing your very first book, for a lot of people, they really want to see that actual print book and have their name in print and see it on a shelf. And equally, distribution's really hard. So getting it out there to places like Waterstones, Barnes and Nobles, the supermarkets that sell books, that's almost impossible for somebody who's an indie publisher. If seeing your name on a book is your ambition, then probably self-publishing isn't the best route for you. If seeing your book in a bookshop is your ambition, then probably self-publishing, indie publishing isn't the best route for you. What I would say though is that a lot of publishers, traditional publishers, particularly some of the smaller ones, have been keeping a close eye on what indie publishers are doing. And so they've been watching them getting quick to market with books. They've been watching them using certain features of Amazon and certain features of other ebook retailers, and how they're using those really effectively to get to the top of the charts and to really make an impact with their writing. And so publishers are changing their ways to a certain extent. They're sometimes changing their royalties. They're often getting books to market quicker. So for example, my publisher Verve is a really good example of a smaller publisher that does the same kind of things that indie publishers do. So gets books to market quicker, focuses on electronic books and e-publications, focuses on the retailers like Amazon and Kobo, where there's a chance to do deals and to get the books up in the charts by being involved in promotions, and operates in a more agile way that in the past we've mostly seen from indie publishers. And so these are independent publishers, smaller publishers often, not necessarily, because there are imprints as well in larger publishers. So for example, HarperCollins HQ Digital, which also does similar kinds of things. So publishers are changing. They are even sometimes paying more in royalty to try and compete with the Amazon self-publishing marketplace. And Amazon are changing as well, in that they're having a traditional publishing model as well, and they have an imprint, Thomas Mercer, that publishes books more traditionally. And also they have more now in order for you to be able to get your book in print. So getting your book out in print is definitely easier than it was when I first tried self-publishing. So the differences are perhaps a bit more subtle than they used to be. So there's perhaps a little bit less difference between putting your book through a traditional process and putting your book through the self-publishing process now than there was, let's say, 5 years ago. But I would still say that the pros and cons that I've just described are the main things to think about if you're trying to decide which route's for you. So don't forget to check out the courses and videos on specifics of self-publishing and traditional publishing, things like finding an agent and how you self-publish, in the description below. There's lots there for you. In the meantime, I'm going to be doing more videos on those subjects in the coming weeks, so watch out for those, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.